Okay, let's dive in. Today we're taking a deep look at U.S. tariffs specifically. The ones that have been making headlines recently, impacting trade with China and, well, countries all over the world.
And for this deep dive, we've pulled from that whole stack of material you shared, everything from detailed news analysis and academic research papers to, conversations happening in online forums.
Right.
Our mission really is to cut through the noise and try to understand what's behind these policies, how they actually work, and what effects we're seeing on the ground.
It can feel like a really technical topic, can it?
Yeah.
Tariffs, trade numbers, but like the material you give us really highlights, this isn't just abstract economics.
Not at all.
It directly impacts things you encounter every single day. The cost of goods when you shop, how efficiently products get from, say, factories to your home.
Yeah, and even in some surprising ways, potentially influencing bigger picture things like global travel or where companies decide to set up manufacturing.
It really touches, well, almost every corner of the global economy.
It does, and the sources show just how many different angles there are to this story, revealing complexities you might not see just, on the surface.
So let's start at the beginning, maybe, because the idea of using tariffs in the U.S., it actually has quite a long history.
Oh, definitely.
The material points out that advocacy for them goes back decades, like long before recent events. You had figures like Donald Trump talking about concerns over trade imbalances and the need to protect domestic manufacturing, even way back in the 1980s.
Right. There's this sort of underlying sentiment, which some of the analysis describes, that the U.S. wasn't getting a fair shake, maybe, that it was being, quote, ripped off.
And that drive to correct perceived imbalances, it seems like it's been a really persistent thread.
It has. This history kind of culminated more recently under the Trump administration with formal actions like the USTR, that's the Office of the United States Trade Representative.
The president's main trade negotiator, essentially.
Exactly. Conducting these really detailed investigations into practices by specific countries, China being a major focus, obviously.
And these investigations zeroed in on things like forced technology requiring foreign companies to hand over their tech just to do business there, and intellectual property theft.
Yeah, and the sources cite some really eye-watering estimates for the cost of those practices to the U.S. economy. Anywhere from, $225 billion up to maybe $600 billion a year?
Huge numbers.
Huge. And those estimates, well, they provided the stated justification for the tariffs that followed. The explicit goals, as laid out in the documents and the analyses you shared, were pretty clear-cut.
That's where...
Address those trade imbalances, shield U.S. industries from what was argued were unfair foreign practices, and even tackle issues framed as national security concerns, like the flow of substances such as fentanyl.
Okay, but here's where the sources get, I think, really interesting. They bring up this idea of Liberation Day tariffs, almost this symbolic date, for a new approach.
Right.
And they suggest there's kind of a two-part rationale going on. The first part, the one that's often stated publicly, is this idea that it's a necessary corrective measure. Yeah. The argument being that decades of, let's say, asymmetric foreign trade barriers against a relatively open U.S. market needed reversing to, well, reindustrialize the U.S., bring manufacturing back.
Yes, that narrative of reclaiming manufacturing is a powerful one, politically and economically. But the material also discusses a more implicit, maybe almost transactional side to it all.
Transactional now.
Well, some of the analysis suggests that tariffs are also seen, perhaps, as a mechanism to generate revenue, potentially as a way to help finance significant domestic policy goals, like, say, sweeping tax cuts, without explicitly adding to the national debt figures.
So sort of a fiscal workaround, using tariff money to offset the cost of tax reductions, maybe making it more palatable to fiscally conservative groups worried about spending.
Precisely. It's framed by some analysts, anyway, as a method to show offsetting revenue on the books.
But there's a problem there, isn't there, as the sources point out?
Yeah, there's an inherent tension, definitely. If your tariffs are super high enough to significantly reduce trade, well, then you actually collect less tariff revenue because fewer goods are coming in to be taxed.
Right. You can't tax what doesn't arrive.
You can't have it both ways, really. You can't fully maximize trade reduction and maximize revenue generation at the same time. It's one or the other, or somewhere in between.
It really highlights that while the goals of reindustrialization and fixing trade imbalances are, front and center, the material suggests there could be this significant underlying political and fiscal motivation shaping the policy, too, maybe even driving it. in some cases.
And understanding that political layer, whether you see it as posturing or as a genuine attempt to finance domestic policy like tax cuts, is presented in the sources as pretty key to grasping the full picture of why these policies are actually being pursued.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. How do these tariffs actually function? Because I think there's often confusion about who's ultimately, footing the bill.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. And your sources are very clear on this. Tariffs are taxes. They're paid by the companies or individuals importing goods into the U.S.
Not by the exporting country directly.
Correct, not directly. When a U.S. business brings in goods, say, from China, they pay the tariff to U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Now, before what people often call the trade war, tariffs on Chinese goods were generally quite low, often, 0.5% range for a lot of products.
Pretty negligible for many things.
Right. But the escalations pushed them up dramatically, 7.5%, 25%, sometimes even higher on certain goods.
And the analysis indicates these new tariffs can actually stack on top of each other.
Yeah, that's a really important aspect. A product could face a tariff under one action, maybe Section 301, which is about unfair trade practices.
Okay.
Plus, potentially another if it's linked to, say, fentanyl supply chains or maybe one of these newer reciprocal tariffs. This stacking effect can lead to incredibly high total duties on some Chinese goods. We're talking potentially approaching 80% or maybe even more in some cases.
Wow, 80%. That's basically prohibitive.
It's a massive barrier, absolutely. Now, speaking of that reciprocal tariff concept that the material highlights, it follows a pretty specific and, well, some might say blunt formula.
Okay, how does that work?
It basically takes the U.S. trade deficit with a particular country, divides that number by the value of U.S. imports from that country, and then cuts the result in half.
That sounds like it doesn't really care why the trade deficit exists in the first place.
It doesn't, according to the analysis we looked at. It's described as a blunt instrument precisely because it penalizes countries based purely on the bilateral trade imbalance number.
Regardless of whether their trade practices are restrictive or if it's just, Americans wanting to buy their stuff.
Exactly. It doesn't make that distinction.
Can you give us some examples? Like, how does that formula shake out for different countries?
Sure. So the European Union, right, they have a pretty substantial trade surplus with the U.S. Under this formula, they'd face a 20% tariff. But here's where it gets interesting. The formula also spits out surprisingly high rates for many economies in South and Southeast Asia, places like Vietnam or Cambodia.
Why them? Are they seen as particularly restrictive?
Not necessarily, no. It's more because the U.S. imports a lot from them relative to what it exports to them. So that ratio in the formula drives the tariff rate up. You can see rates easily topping 30%, sometimes pushing towards 50%.
And the sources even mentioned some really kind of strange outliers, like the Falkland Islands facing a 42% tariff.
Yeah, that one definitely makes you pause and wonder about the logic beyond just applying this formula mechanically across the board. It raises questions about the intended scope versus maybe unintended consequences.
Are there exceptions to these tariffs?
There are, yes. The material notes several. Goods already covered by Section 232 tariffs, think steel and aluminum, they're exempt from these newer ones.
Okay.
Also, strategic sectors the U.S. wants to, protect or encourage domestically, like semiconductors, critical minerals, pharmaceuticals, those are often carved out.
Makes sense. What about our neighbors?
Goods from Canada and Mexico that meet the rules of origin under the USMCA. The trade deal that replaced NAFTA, they're generally exempt too. Though, interestingly, fentanyl-related goods originating there are still subject to a tariff. That's a specific carve-out.
Okay, so an exception to the exception.
Sort of, yeah. And there's also a provision about U.S. content. If a product has at least 20% U.S. origin content, the tariff only applies to the non-U.S. portion.
Got it. Okay, so we see how they work, who pays. What about the immediate economic fallout? What are the sources saying are the direct consequences we can actually see?
Well, the most immediate and probably the most tangible effect, the one that hits closest to home for you listening, is on prices.
Right.
The analysis shows pretty clearly that companies importing goods hit with these higher tariffs, they often pass those costs directly onto consumers or onto other businesses if they're buying intermediate inputs for manufacturing.
And how much are prices going up?
Prices for the affected goods, whether finished products or components, they seem to rise by about 10% to 30%, which, roughly mirrors the tariff rate itself.
And the data backs this up, doesn't it? Like the Consumer Price Index, the CPI.
Yeah, the CPI figures for goods that were tariffed showed a measurably larger increase compared to similar goods that weren't hit with tariffs. The correlation is quite clear in the data cited.
And when you zoom out and look at the broader economy, the models.
Yeah, when you look at the modeled economic impacts, the picture gets, well, even starker maybe. One model cited estimates a reduction in U.S. GDP that's the total value of everything produced by about 0.8%.
Which sounds small, but translates to?
Translates to roughly $300 billion in lost annual output. Not insignificant.
And overall prices, do they rise across the board?
Yes, the models predict a general increase in the overall price level throughout the economy, somewhere in the range of 7.1% to 9.5%.
Ouch. And wages.
Well, here's the tricky part. Nominal wages, just the dollar amount you get paid, might go up slightly, but real wages, which is your pay adjusted for that rising cost of living.
Your actual purchasing power.
Exactly. Your purchasing power is actually expected to fall. So you might see a few more dollars in your paycheck, but they buy less stuff.
That point about real wages falling feels really critical. And the sources also emphasize something else. Tariffs basically function like a consumption tax, right?
They do. And like most consumption taxes, they tend to be regressive.
Meaning they hit lower-income households harder?
Disproportionately hard, yeah. Why? Because those families tend to spend a larger percentage of their income on essential goods, food, clothing, household items, many of which are imported or contain imported components.
So the tariff costs eat up a bigger slice of their budget.
Exactly. While potentially the revenue generated from those tariffs might be used to fund things like tax cuts, which, depending on how they're structured, could disproportionately benefit wealthier individuals or corporations.
Okay, so beyond just prices and wages, the sources detail pretty significant disruption to global supply chains. This seems like another major area of impact.
Oh, it really is. Global supply chains are these incredibly complex, interconnected networks. They're built for efficiency, usually.
Right.
When you suddenly introduce major barriers like steep tariffs, it forces companies to scramble. They have to reroute shipments, find entirely new suppliers, maybe even rethink where they manufacture things altogether.
And the analysis shows output falls most sharply in sectors that are really deeply integrated into these global value chains, or GVCs.
That's right. Deeply integrated means their production process involves parts and components crossing borders multiple times before the final product is even assembled.
Like electronics or cars.
Exactly. Think about your smartphone or your car parts might come from a dozen different countries. Sectors like electrical equipment, electronics, transport equipment, they're highlighted as particularly vulnerable to these kinds of disruptions. Output can fall quite sharply there.
And global trade overall takes a hit.
Yes. The models show total global trade flow shrinking by maybe 5.5% to 8.5% in these scenarios. And trade within those complex GVCs, that shrinks even more dramatically.
How much more?
Well, in sectors like transport equipment or electrical equipment, the analysis suggests output could contract by something like 16% or 12% respectively, especially in scenarios where other countries retaliate with their own tariffs.
The sources also mentioned something about the vulnerability of U.S. just-in-time inventory systems.
Ah, yeah. U.S. businesses often rely on keeping very lean inventories, just enough stock on hand to meet immediate needs. It maximizes efficiency, minimizes storage costs.
But it's risky in a trade war.
It becomes a real weakness, yeah. If there's a sudden disruption to imports because of tariffs, or if costs spike unexpectedly, those lean inventories mean you have no buffer. Some companies reacted by stockpiling goods before tariffs hit.
Trying to get ahead of it.
Right, but even that adds costs, storage, financing, and it contributes to inflationary pressures too. It's not a free solution.
And for China, the sources seem to suggest they drew a key lesson from all this.
It seems they did. They appear to realize that despite efforts by the U.S. to diversify supply chains, certain critical areas are still quite reliant on Chinese manufacturing or components. This makes inventory logistics a kind of potential Achilles heel for the U.S.
Meaning China could exploit it.
The material notes that China could potentially leverage this vulnerability, not just with counter tariffs, but with non-tariff measures. Things like administrative hurdles, new technical standards, maybe even just deliberate delays on shipments headed for the U.S., things that gum up the works.
Now, one group that faced particularly brutal consequences, according to the material, was U.S. farmers. China was historically a massive market for that, right?
It was their single largest market for years, especially for things like soybeans. But the tariffs and the retaliatory tariffs from China caused a dramatic collapse.
How bad was it?
Exports of U.S. agricultural products to China just plummeted. From over $19 billion in 2017 down to just over $9 billion in 2018. That's a massive drop.
And specific states felt it acutely.
Oh, yeah. Analyses called out states like Iowa, Illinois, Kansas, showing hundreds of millions in annualized losses just from the China situation.
And the tariffs on some key ag goods, like those soybeans, reached just punishing levels.
Absolutely devastating for those farmers. We're talking 80% to 100% tariffs imposed by China in retaliation.
Did they manage to find other markets?
They did try and had some success. The sources mentioned diverting exports to places like Mexico, Egypt, the EU. It partially offset some losses, but it didn't fully replace the sheer volume that used to go to China.
And then there was the Phase 1 agreement with China.
Right. That included a commitment from China to significantly boost purchases of U.S. ag products. The target was around $40 billion a year.
But the sources indicate they didn't quite hit that number.
No, the analysis suggests they only met about 73% of that purchase target over the 2 years the agreement covered. So better than the lows of the trade war, but still short of the goal.
And you see these ripple effects throughout the economy too, don't you? Like the material mentioned a Taiwanese LCD manufacturer going bankrupt, partly because of trade war vulnerability.
Yeah, some companies were just too exposed, too reliant on smooth trade flows. And you also saw trade getting rerouted, maybe goods going through countries in Asia and Southeast Asia to try and avoid direct U.S. China tariffs. It just adds complexity and cost.
The disruption really spreads beyond just the U.S. and China.
Absolutely. It impacts the entire global trading system.
So how have other countries and markets reacted to all these U.S. tariff moves? What are the sources saying?
Well, it's been pretty varied, according to the material. Recent news about potential new tariffs got a, quote, chilly reception in some Asian markets. You saw stock indices falling in places like Hong Kong and Japan.
And China's response itself, it seems multifaceted.
It is. They've vowed countermeasures, of course, but also made official statements emphasizing things like, abiding by consensus, keeping promises, mutual respect, trying to sound reasonable on the world stage.
But taking actions too.
Oh, yes. There's a note about China limiting export licenses for rare earths for a 6-month period. Those are minerals critical for lots of high-tech industries.
Leverage.
Exactly. While at the same time, the U.S. reportedly eased some of its own export restrictions on things like jet engines and ethane, possibly as a sort of quid pro quo to get those rare earth controls eased.
And the sources include a particularly strong statement from China about Hong Kong.
Yes, accusing the U.S. of undermining Hong Kong's prosperity by imposing high tariffs and pointing out the irony that Hong Kong is actually a major source of the U.S. trade surplus, not a deficit contributor.
Underscoring the geopolitical tensions.
Absolutely. And other major players are figuring out their responses too. The European Union, for instance, is reportedly developing countermeasures. They might even use their new anti-coercion instrument that's a legal tool designed specifically to respond to economic pressure from other countries.
But it's not like everyone's ganging up on the U.S., right?
No, not entirely. Japan and South Korea apparently distanced themselves from reports they were coordinating responses with China. And some countries, like Australia and New Zealand, have explicitly said they won't retaliate.
So a mixed bag.
Very much so. While others, like Brazil, have actually passed legislation giving their government the authority to retaliate if they feel it's necessary. So it's a really fragmented global picture.
And even within the U.S., the sources highlight divided opinions.
Right.
Even among, say, Republican senators.
Yeah, the material mentions some senators acknowledging the tariffs are hurtful, particularly to agriculture, while others strongly maintain they are a necessary tool, maybe the only effective tool, to gain leverage with China.
It really feels like there's this fundamental debate playing out. Is this power-based approach to trade the way forward, or should we stick to the more cooperative framework like the WTO, flawed as it might be?
Exactly. And the analysis suggests that using this kind of power-based approach, especially against a country with the economic size and, frankly, the political structure of China, is inherently risky.
Riskier against China specifically. Why?
Because China, the material argues, has both the economic weight and the political will, maybe more centralized political will, for a prolonged standoff. They can potentially endure economic pain longer or direct resources more easily than a more decentralized market economy.
Leading to
what one analysis described as a dangerous game of mutual pain and destruction, where both economies end up suffering significant, maybe even lasting damage with no clear winner.
But the sources also acknowledge that, from the perspective of other countries, this isn't just a U.S. versus China issue, is it?
No, that's an important point. It's often seen internationally as part of a broader, maybe overdue global pushback against some of China's specific trade practices, things like state subsidies, market access issues that many nations have had grievances about for years.
So the U.S. actions might be controversial, but the underlying complaints resonate elsewhere.
That broader international perspective is definitely present in the material, yeah. Recognizing shared frustrations.
Okay, before we wrap this up, it feels crucial, just as the material you share does, to really acknowledge the layers of nuance and complexity here. It's not black and white.
Absolutely not. The sources definitely agree there are legitimate grievances the U.S. has raised about how the global trading system currently works or doesn't work.
Like what specifically?
Well, they point out that the existing framework, particularly the World Trade Organization, the WTO, has really struggled to effectively deal with massive industrial subsidies, especially from state-owned enterprises, or requirements for foreign companies to transfer valuable technology, or, widespread intellectual property theft. These are serious issues China has been accused of.
And these aren't minor complaints.
Not at all. And studies, like the well-known China Shock research papers, have indeed estimated significant losses of U.S. manufacturing jobs that were pretty clearly linked to the surge in import competition from China, particularly after China joined the WTO. The impact on those specific communities and workers was very real and very painful.
Those impacts are undeniable, the sources agree.
However, the sources also directly challenge the narrative that places the sole, or even the primary, blame for the overall decline in U.S. manufacturing employment purely on bad trade deals or competition from China.
So if it's not just trade, what do they point to as the bigger driver of lost manufacturing jobs?
Automation, technology, productivity gains. One widely cited study estimated that technology and automation accounted for something like a staggering 88% of the decline in U.S. manufacturing jobs between 2000 and 2010.
88% from automation and tech versus maybe 12% linked to trade. That's a huge difference.
It fundamentally shifts the perspective on the root cause, doesn't it? The sources point out that even while manufacturing employment was falling, U.S. manufacturing output, the actual amount of stuff being made, actually increased significantly over the past couple of decades. We got much more efficient at making things.
Doing more with fewer people.
Exactly. And related to that, the U.S. economy as a whole has undergone this major structural transformation, moving much more towards services, things like finance, healthcare, software, entertainment sectors, where the U.S. is highly competitive globally.
And where the U.S. actually runs a substantial trade surplus.
Right.
Which often gets lost when the whole conversation is just about the deficit in physical goods.
Precisely. That services surplus is significant. So the key takeaway from this section, according to the material, seems to be, yes, the decline in manufacturing jobs is real. It's painful for those affected, but it's driven by multiple complex forces. Technology being a massive one, shifts in domestic demand, global competition.
And tariffs alone can't fix all that.
And using broad, high tariffs as the main tool just might not be equipped to effectively address all of those underlying complex factors. It might be too blunt an instrument for such a multifaceted problem.
So looking back at this whole deep dive then, it's clear that U.S. tariff policies are being pursued with these stated goals, right? Correcting trade imbalances, protecting domestic industries. But the analysis you provided also strongly suggests these potential implicit goals are maybe just as important, generating revenue, possibly helping to finance tax cuts, serving as political strategy, sending signals.
Yeah, those underlying currents seem significant. And while those legitimate grievances about global trade practices, especially concerning China, are acknowledged across the board in the sources,
right,
the sources also consistently highlight the significant concrete economic costs of these broad tariffs. We're talking higher prices for you, for consumers, and for businesses. Major disruptions to these really intricate global supply chains, a likely reduction in real wages, your purchasing power, and of course the resulting geopolitical friction and uncertainty.
It really is a multi-layered approach with complex and maybe often unintended consequences kind of revealed through all the material you shared.
The effects just ripple through the economy and across international relationships in really profound ways. It's not a simple cause and effect situation.
Okay, so here's maybe a final thought to leave everyone with, building on this deep dive. Given all these complexities we've discussed, the economic costs that the sources highlight, the disruptions, and the potential for prolonged international conflict, what does all this really suggest about how effective tariffs can truly be as the primary weapon, let's say, in 21st century global economic competition? It certainly gives you a lot to think about.